We are ready to start our next panel, which is going to be on getting your pro-immigrant message out in a difficult environment. My name is Bridget Cusick. I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for Jesuit Refugee Service, which just this past week on November 14th celebrated our 44th anniversary. Incidentally, the same day on which our founder, Father Pedro Arrupe, now servant of God, Pedro Arrupe, advanced a step on his hopeful path to canonization. JRS, as we're as we're shortly known, is originated out of the need following the Vietnam War to serve Southeast Asian refugees. We're now in 58 countries around the world, including the United States. As we were prepping for this panel the other day, one of our panelists said, basically, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Things are bleak. It is not, people are not on our side. And we're going to hear more about what the research shows. I would say that, the difference between this panel and the last one will be how to turn that research into action. We're going to hear from everybody at this table about what they have done that they feel has been particularly effective, maybe what they have done that hasn't worked quite so well, and I think the lessons that we can learn from those things. This will encompass not just messaging and communications, but also advocacy and organizing. So here's how things will kind of go. Everybody's going to give about a 5 to 7 minute presentation. And then I'll ask some follow-up questions, and as in the previous panel, we'll take some questions then from the audience and want to also be able to take some from online, if any come in. We're going to start today with Edafe Okporo. Edafe is the founder and executive director of Refuge America and the author of Asylum, a Memoir and Manifesto. He fled persecution in his homeland of Nigeria and is now a passionate advocate for LGBTQ refugees. We will then go to Steve Choi, who is the founder and lead strategist of the Ellis Island Initiative, a statewide coalition of labor, business, and immigrant rights groups. He has he's pretty familiar with putting together coalitions. He previously served as the executive director of the New York Immigration Coalition from 2013 to 2020. And he has done this numerous times on a statewide level, coalitions consisting of hundreds of different organizations. And we will finish up with Rommel Ojeda, who is a bilingual journalist and filmmaker based here in New York. He is the community correspondent for Documented, an independent nonprofit newsroom dedicated to reporting about and for the immigrant communities of New York. So with that, Edafe.
Thank you. Many of you remember the place you were in 2016 when Trump won the first presidency. I do remember. I was locked up in a detention center in New Jersey with 44 other people in my dorm. Majority of us did not know if we would make it out into America. And many people in my dorm that night were Mexicans, Colombians, Venezuelans, who have committed crime, who were arrested from ICE, from the police into ICE detention. And the reality was like, America didn't want any of us to come into America. That was the narrative I was faced with 8 years ago. So last 2 weeks when Trump won, I was outside running for election to become a city council person in New York City, and everybody was pretty bleak and depressed. And I was like, if I could fight back from being in a detention center, what would stop me from fighting back living outside in America? So many of you might really be depressed about the results. I'm an optimist. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that I'm going to make a case for why immigration is not good. I'm not doing that. And many people who are around me are faced with the same circumstances that when life become good for you in America, you turn your back against people like you who are trying to come to America. That hasn't worked for me before. I don't know if it's going to start working for me now. July 23rd, 2016 was the morning of my birthday. I won't forget that day because that was the same day I was stripped of the idea and sense of home. I was woken up by a mob chanting, "We have found out he's gay and we're going to kill him." I knew at that moment I had one of two options. I might be killed by this group of mob this very day, or I might be beaten and left for dead. Luckily, I was beaten, left unconscious, for dead. I woke up in an hospital and knew I had one option. I had to flee in search of safety to find a new home. When I came to America, I was very naive of what America was. I was an asylum seeker at the border, and I felt like I was going to have a sense of safety and belonging. That wasn't the case. I didn't come through the US-Mexico border. I flew in through JFK. I am an exception, an abnormality. The people we don't talk about when we talk about immigration. It's people like me who have a college degree from our countries and come to America and quote unquote become the accepted few. Although I had a pretty terrible story that granted me asylum within a short period of stay at the immigration detention center. But when I came out, there was one of two people I met in America. And this is why I decided to become an eternal optimist. The first people I met were self-righteous. They feel like immigrants like me should come to America, and at no cost should anyone prevent someone like me. When you do so, you are morally of a wrong standing, and you shouldn't be in the conversation. That blocks people from even trying to be a part of the conversation because you're either pro-immigrants or you are a bad person. The family that welcomed me when I came out of the detention center because I was homeless and didn't have a place to go, and like many asylum seekers who are granted asylum, the government does not give you any single benefits. It's not like when you come out from the immigration detention center, you have a place to stay, you have a social security, none of that. You still need organization. Kelly is there. When I came out of the immigration detention center, Catholic Charities took me to social security to register me to have a social security. There were still a lot of organizations that had to move me from one place to another. All the people that are morally upright, that fight for pro-migrant legislation, that call people bad and evil for not supporting migrants, none of them was at Catholic Charity taking me to Social Security. None of them know what it's like for an immigrant to resettle in America. So you are not morally upright when you don't know what it takes to resettle a new immigrant. The second set of people I met, they are policy wonks. They understand the economics of immigration and want to make a case for it. They make statements like this: 1 in every 17 people on earth are currently displaced. And I ask, how does that affect the day-to-day Americans who want to support one of the 17 displaced persons? They don't know where to start. It's a national conversation that we need to rethink. I was lucky enough as a pro-immigrant voice to have had the opportunity to be in spaces to shape legislation that affect me. But when I go into these spaces, I am one among thousands of people that don't look like me. So for us to have a pro-immigrant voice, we have to be, one, better storytellers. And the people that have to tell the stories, they're not, I don't want to be offensive to anybody, but I just want to speak my emotional truths, like Asa Minaj. The people that are going to be these storytellers and make this change, they don't find themselves in the rooms that require them to make that change. Look at the 9 resettlement agencies that are meant to resettle refugees. The leaders in those organizations do not have immigrants, refugees that have resettled in America. So when they are trying to pass a message, they are trying to be the morally upright people that tell people how it should be done. And people do not believe them because they do not look like the people they are trying to help. So we need more people that look like the people we're trying to help to come into the room to tell their emotional truths, because we are a story being and story connect us together. No matter the data you present before somebody. My husband, for example, is a Republican, born in Long Island, and changed his party affiliation to Democrats. And I was discussing with him before the election. I was like, just put your Republican hat for a second, but you will take it off. What messaging have you heard from the Democratic Party that says we are pro-immigrant and this is how we resettle or integrate new immigrants coming to the country? We are all disappointed and say that people voted against their interests. What was the alternative that was provided for these people to choose? I, as an immigrant, a gay man, a refugee, an African, I am the minorities of minority. There was no messaging for me. I voted for Kamala Harris because I felt as a Democrat, that is what I should do. That is not how you pass a message. Unfortunately, more people will be forced to flee their home, and more countries are becoming more nationalistic. I ask, the solution is not to continually rub our faith of being kind people and Christians in people's faces. It's not going to change how people view people like me. Stephen Larson said, the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. What we have been asking people for is peace. We say, let's accept more immigrants. And people say, why should we? And we said, it's just a good thing to do. It's not good enough. It has to make sense to people. That is why I try to create solutions using the universal currency we all have, which is storytelling. My organization, Refuge America, has a bold vision of making America a place of welcome. We are a story-first organization and a story-driven organization. What that means is that for us to be able to create change, we have to connect to others. So we seek connection, no matter the party where the person comes from, no matter their political ideology. We try to connect each other to the universal idea that we all want safety and belonging. And as a local leader in New York City, I have worked with a lot of people. I don't know their political ideology, but they come together and say, in our community, we're hosting a meal for Syrians, and we want to welcome them to our community because we feel is something important to do. But now it seems like our research is based on our own individual biases, which is right. As researchers, you all have individual biases. But when your bias overcomes the story, it prevents others from accessing the story. Last thing I would say as an internal optimist is that under the Trump first presidency, I was running the first shelter for asylum seekers in New York City. I created the first shelter for asylum seekers in New York City. And a lot of New Yorkers wanted to make a difference in the life of people that were coming to New York City. But they just needed an entry point into the narrative. Your responsibility is to create an entry point for people to be able to access the narrative. And we cannot do that if we continually beat people on the head to tell them our truths. We have to use our emotional truths. A currency we all have is storytelling. When I went to NYU to do my master's, I graduated. Everybody was like, you should go back to nonprofit. You're a good storyteller. I took a job with Ipsos. At Ipsos, I was doing market research, and I was helping nonprofit organizations like UNAIDS, UNICEF to do their data and storytelling. And one thing I saw consistently is that when the data comes out and prove the bias that it is good, how we tell it is also important. When you start by telling someone it is good, reverse psychology, they always see it the other way. The first way you start to tell the story is to say, on this day or on that day, when your ancestors came here, this is what they needed to begin their life. An entry point is what most people need right now. So one thing I want you to take away from here, when you go back, ivory tower or not, leader of nonprofit or not, is like, where is the entry point for the public and where is the entry point for people who you are trying to help make their life different? Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm standing up here because everybody else is standing up here, and I felt like I needed to do the same thing. Good morning, my name is Steve Choi. I'm the founder and lead strategist of the Ellis Island Initiative. And the Ellis Island Initiative is really about how do we convince non-immigrant folks to be supportive of immigrant communities. And I want to thank Edafe for that very moving piece that he just said, because in so many ways, what he is trying to do is very similar to what we at the Ellis Island Initiative are trying to do, but from a very different perspective. And I really appreciate the emphasis on storytelling and really being able to share people's personal experiences. A little bit of background about myself. I used to run the New York Immigration Coalition. It's good to see some former friends. Well, I hope they're not former friends. I hope they're still friends. Former bosses, Carmen Macchione from Catholic Charities on Long Island, Mario Russell, who served as board members of the NYC. And when I ran the New York Immigration Coalition, you know, a lot of times the Immigration Coalition, the NYC, was really founded to help immigrants fight for their own rights in New York State. And so a lot of times people would come to me and they'd say, why don't you organize non-immigrants? And I would say, well, first of all, nobody is giving us any money to do that. And that's obviously consideration number one. But second of all, that wasn't our mission. Our mission was to organize immigrants to fight for their own rights. But that didn't mean that that wasn't something that was worth actually pursuing. And so, you know, I left the Immigration Coalition after 7 years, and I was a consultant, but I had a conversation actually with an old friend who is the political director of 1199 SCIU, one of the largest labor unions in the country. And so we were looking at what was happening in New York State in the fall of last year, almost exactly a year ago. And if we can take us back there, at the time, you know, hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers had made their way to New York City, and New York City was trying to move them to different areas across the state. And it was a lack of organizing. I'm going to be very honest. It was a total, let's see, what's the PG-13 word I'm looking for here? It was a disaster. It was a disaster. And really, when you look at it, if you're going to do that, you've got to do a lot of on-the-ground organizing before you end up sending folks. And that did not happen. And so what you saw was that this was red meat to Republican elected officials who were looking at an upcoming election and said, oh, this is going to be something I'm going to jump into. And so you saw all sorts of narratives. People were saying, I cannot believe they're sending homeless, criminals, people who are unvetted, child rapists, all of that. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And you know, you saw these elected officials, you know, trying to stop these buses of asylum seekers coming like they were, you know, like democracy activists trying to stop a tank in Tiananmen Square. It was really gross the way in which people just jumped on this and tried to score some really cheap political points. And so as I was watching this and really talking to 1199, we were extremely concerned, obviously, because of the way in which this resettlement was being handled was just a disaster when you looked at the implementation, but also in terms of the narrative. We had spent so much time, and so many of the Immigration Coalition's allies had been working so hard over, honestly, decades to figure out how to promote and get people to accept the reality that immigrants, refugees, were positive and beneficial for these upstate communities in Utica, in Rochester, Syracuse, Erie County. And some of that work was really being jeopardized by this really haphazard resettlement that was happening in a hot minute that New York City was leading. So we said, okay, well, what can we do about this? And that's really where the Ellis Island Initiative was born. What can we do to really do the on-the-ground organizing of local community leaders in some of these upstate places? And we were doing it after the fact, but we still thought it important to be done. What can we do to organize particularly non-immigrant community leaders? People who are small business owners, people who are local labor leaders, faith leaders, local elected officials. What can we do to organize and give them a voice and a vehicle to basically say, this can actually be beneficial for our local communities, because people were not making that argument strongly enough. And so that was really what we were focused on. That continues to be the kernel that the Ellis Island Initiative is really built around. How do we convince people that immigrants, recent immigrants, and yes, migrants and asylum seekers can be beneficial for those upstate communities? And so we've really focused on two things. One is to organize those local leaders, and two, to pursue a path of narrative change. What can we do with earned media, op-eds, and also paid media to think about how we can really move the narrative? And so before we started to get this message out there, we said we first need to figure out where people are. And so we've commissioned actually 2 rounds of polling where we actually surveyed, we worked with the Heart Research Institute, and we did surveys of folks upstate outside of New York City. And I'm going to share with you some very cold hearth truths. And so I want to share a couple slides from that. Okay, I got the jump scare coming. All right. So the narrative around immigration, I'm going to be honest, is a problem, right? And it is viewed negatively. And if the results of the last election didn't convince you of that, I want to share some polling, the most recent polling that we did in August. So first we asked people, is this a problem? 3/4 of New Yorkers viewed the migrant situation as a problem, right? This is a problem, either a somewhat serious problem or a serious problem. This is the reality. This is the way that folks are thinking about this, right? And this is the survey that we did with Heart Research Institute, which is a very respected poll. Now, you might think, well, people might think it's a problem, but they might not blame migrants. They might not think that it's necessarily having a bad impact. That would be wrong. The reality is, and this is a cold, sobering, harsh reality, is that when we asked, is this having a positive, a neutral, or a negative impact, 63% of people think this is having a negative impact. 13% think that it's a positive one, right? And so we should be super clear that we are fighting an uphill battle. The reality is that New Yorkers, the ones that we surveyed, and this is a legit poll, think that this is a problem and they don't like it. And when we asked, what are some of the concerns, right? You can see the concerns. The concerns are about crime. They're about taking resources away from quote-unquote native New Yorkers while migrants are getting benefits, right? They're concerned about the cost to taxpayers. Now, are these rooted in truth? No, they are not, right? And I think Edafe very eloquently talked about how these are not, right? You don't get all these amazing benefits if you come as an asylum seeker. But let's be real. This slide looks like Donald Trump's talking points. That's the reality, right? And the reason why he and others like Stephen Miller and other people talked about this is because they knew that it was a winning political argument. That's the reality that we are looking at, right? So we should not kid ourselves in terms of what we're thinking about, in terms of I'll just talk about New York, the New York public and what they're thinking and what they're believing about migrants and asylum seekers. So here's a really interesting slide when we talked about, well, what do we want to do about this, right? And there obviously are some not great policy proposals in here, but there actually are a couple that I want to draw your attention to, right? I would say take a look at the 4th and the 5th bullet points here. It's about, these actually polled positively, right? And when you focused on jobs, when you focused on employers, local employers who need workers, there's support for this, right? And so, I think if we're trying to sift through some of these bad messages, there's some glimmers of hope that I would say, right? There is support for allowing asylum seekers, recent immigrants to find jobs and to work legally, right? And again, I'm not saying that these are the things that I believe in, but these are some policy proposals that the people we surveyed looked at positively. So I think, this is important, right? The economics angle of these economic policy proposals were ones that people actually looked upon kind of favorably. And then when you looked at this is actually really, really illuminating. And we actually have a couple slides that dig into all the messages that we put out there in terms of the top reasons for welcoming migrants. But it's pretty clear that the economics angle right now, when we're looking at people in August 2024, this is kind of compelling. And you can see the top polling messages here, most of them around economics, around jobs, around benefits to local communities. But there is an interesting one here, right? The third highest polling one was about migrant families. Migrant families will face violence and severe poverty if we refuse to give them safe refuge. This is more of a moral argument, and yet this was very resonant as well. Happy to share the whole list of arguments, and I'll get into them a little bit later. So I would say that we have really designed our messaging and communications work at the Ellis Island Initiative around some of these findings to emphasize this. And look, there's other entities out there, the Immigration Coalition and a lot of other entities that are out there doing different kinds of messages, and that's great, and that's fine. But for the lane that we wanted to occupy, we wanted to focus in on this. And the great thing is that we've gotten a ton of media hits. Since our founding, we've got 33 media hits. We've gotten 11 op-eds placed. Here's a handful of op-eds that we've been able to place. And you can see some of these folks are not necessarily the people that you would think of as immigrant advocates, right? You have Doug Hovey, who runs this independent living center for folks with disabilities in the Hudson Valley, right? You have David Fisher, the president of the New York State Farm Bureau. When I was at the Immigration Coalition, always wanted to work with him and get him to support things like driver's licenses. He would never take my call. But now, all of a sudden, because we came at him with a different kind of framework, and honestly, because it's in his self-interest representing farmers, he was willing to work with us, and not just work with us, but to write an op-ed in the Buffalo News. Same thing, we got chambers of commerce in basically everywhere that we had convenings who were more than willing to work with us. And we worked actually in Westchester. We did a convening in Westchester, and we worked with the Business Council of Westchester. And there's a guy, John Ravitz, great guy. He's the vice president of something there. I don't know exactly. But, he was super gung-ho about working with us. And I was like, great, we'll work together. He helped to convene a bunch of people. And Carola Bracco, who many of you might know, she runs Neighbors Link in Westchester in the Hudson Valley. She was like, I can't believe you got John Ravitz. Do you know who he is? And I was like, I have no idea, but he loves us. I guess he was a Republican assembly member, and he steadfastly did not support driver's licenses. And I didn't know this backstory, but he was more than willing to work with us and was one of our key conveners for our Westchester Hudson Valley convening. So, we've really been able to, I think there's something there. When we did our Rochester convening, we got we had this Rochester convening, and we had the mayor, we had the county exec there, and we had a bunch of businesses and folks like that. There were four TV pieces that ran right after that were at least 2 minutes. And so, you know, I was like, you all must have a slow news day in Rochester because it is not really that newsworthy. But it just goes to show that there is a hunger and a desire, and I think an opportunity for us to lean in and get some of these unlikely stakeholders, some of these folks from the business and local communities, to actually weigh in on behalf of immigrants. And so the last leg of the narrative change piece that I wanted to share is paid media as well. So we raised a small amount of money to do an ad buy that ran in some of these upstate counties. So if we could run that. This is very fancy. This is, you click on the image and then there's a video that pops up. It's very, very fancy, at least for me. Well, it's supposed to do that. There we go. Well, it's going to load up at some point, I think. Jaden, I think if you click on the link, or there should be like a hyperlink behind that image. All right, as it's loading up, here's what I would say. We got these 33 media hits. We got these 11 op-eds. There we go. And we got this paid media piece that I wanted to just show you. And it's something that we ran
New York
in
is at a
October.
crossroads. Businesses have jobs they can't fill. People are leaving in record numbers. And DC gridlock means there's no plan for the folks who want to come here. Enough political games around immigration. It's time for common sense and local solutions. Our communities are ready to connect immigrants to open jobs and training so they can contribute to our economy, because it helps all of us. No more playing politics with our future. Let's get to work, New York.
So this is not a political ad, but it ran in October. At the same time, the airwaves were completely taken over by political messaging that had all sorts of terrible things out there, particularly in upstate communities. And keep in mind that our paid media hits, our op-eds, our earned media hits, this is happening at a time where there's explosive articles about like the murder of a woman by an asylum seeker in the Syracuse area, or by an alleged rape or sexual assault that happened in the Albany area, again, by an asylum seeker. So honestly, I highly, highly doubt there are articles or op-eds are going to be a full antidote to some of those stories that are out there, right? But I think that if there's a lesson to be learned here, it's that this is an uphill fight, right? But we need to use every single one of our methods out there to flood the zone and to change the narrative, because that's what the other side is doing, right? We focused on economics because that was our lane. We focused on economics and jobs and employers because that's who we were organizing. And we should be really clear-eyed about that. And so, when I'm talking to a lot of the progressive organizations that I work with closely, one of the messages that I hear a lot of organizations talk about is, these migrants and asylums are coming here just like our grandparents came 100 years ago. They're coming to escape the same kind of violence, and they're looking for a better life just like our grandparents and your grandparents. And guess what? That was the lowest polling message that we had, right? And so we got to be clear about that. If you're in the progressive movement, which I count myself as part of, you have to know that that's not compelling right now. And so some people would ask me, should we not use that message? And I say we absolutely should, because the only way that we're going to do this, we cannot give up on those messages. We focus on ours because it was compelling at this particular moment, and that was our lane. But I sincerely believe that if we're going to change the narrative, if we're going to change those really sobering stats that I showed at the beginning, it's going to take every single one of our efforts. We are going to have to flood the zone with messages around economics and jobs, sure, of course, but also around morals, also around our common values, and all these kinds of other messages that we need to put out there. It's, at the end of the day, it's really going to require all of our efforts to be out there in as much force as all these other folks are using on the opposite side. That, in my mind, is the only way that we're really going to be able to change the narrative long term. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Edafe. That's amazing. So my name is Rommel, and I'm a journalist. I cover the Latino communities and Spanish-speaking communities in New York City. And a lot of the work that we do is based on community engagement, which is dropping in the community, staying there, listening to their needs, and then producing content based on that. And from the panelists right here, one of the things that I wanted to highlight is, the messaging that we're sending out there, but also the approach of being, grassroots and talking to people that are in the communities, right? And I wanted to emphasize that. Let me see if this works. Oops. So I wanted to emphasize that because, okay, I think there's something going on. But anyway, so I wanted to emphasize the need for like local messaging, because a lot of the times right now, what we're seeing is that national sentiment is being driven by social media and other, platforms that not necessarily have any fact checking or don't have certain information that is credible, right? And what is happening is people who are living, let's say in Mississippi, for example, they're seeing this constant news about immigrants being criminals, and even though they don't have any immigrants in their communities, they feel that that is their problem too, and that incentivizes them to continue this narrative against immigration. And so what we're trying to do at Documented is sort of find a way to really take the messaging into the local communities to see what is the things that they want to learn about, right? And let me see if this is working now. Oops. Okay. So basically, what we want to show is, first of all, the impact of local news. And in this case, we can say local information. And what has been shown is that it oh, sure. You can take it out. Oh, perfect. Look, so what we have seen is that the importance of local information increases government accountability and also increases civic participation in the local communities, right? And I want to emphasize this because going back to my original point of view is that if people don't know that migrants are part of their community, what we're talking when we say the word migrant is just this very, abstract term. And what we're trying to do with local newsrooms is to sort of find a way to change the narrative so that we don't use or we avoid using the term migrant right away. Instead, we humanize them by saying who this person is in terms of being part of society. For example, we have done, let me see if this works. What we have done is, done some profiles on people doing amazing work in the community, like Adam Abba, for example. And the idea is, to show how they're doing the work in a cultural appropriate way. Because a lot of the times, we have people doing great work, but it doesn't reach the communities that they want to reach, right? So one of the things that we're also doing is, in terms of humanizing people, is really showing the aspect of this DACA recipient being a father first, which is something that we can all relate to, or if we have a brother or a nephew, things like that, right? So it's really moving away from the term which has been so polarized of, asylum seeker, a migrant, and saying like, this is a human being in your community, he's part of the PTA, he's part of your kids' school, and this is their stories. Of course, we can also highlight the fact that they face a lot of challenges, being DACA recipients or being migrants. But I think sometimes media, we tend to focus too much on victimizing people to get people to feel bad, that we end up doing more damage than we actually are trying to do. The other thing is also that, and it's something that we already see happening with a lot of the organizations in New York, is empowering people with information. However, what I've heard, at least, talking to immigrants in Jackson Heights during the elections, is that a lot of information that is being put out there is just not reaching to them. So all the research, that we create, we need to find a way to really make it accessible to people in platforms where they are, and it can be, adapting to Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and any other platform that is coming, in the future. But also just going to churches, going to community centers, really, tailoring down information in ways that is accessible to them. Because if we are creating something and the only people that are consuming that information is people that already agree with us, it doesn't really make the impact that we're trying to do in terms of reaching across the aisle. So one of the things that, from a journalist perspective, what we're trying to do and what we emphasize is really listening to the information that is needed and also being present when things are not hot, because a lot of the times journalism has been very extractive. People just dropping in and out, and then the communities are left there and they just become bylines for other people to consume. And also is really emphasizing the solutions being done. It can be, for example, Mixteca doing amazing work in terms of mental health access for immigrants in a way that is culturally accessible. And also collaborating with organizations. One of the things that we did is we teamed up with New York Legal Assistance Group, and we were fighting misinformation about the workplace. We went to this church on a Monday morning where there were 120 asylum seekers. And the idea was not to change their mind, but just to let them know that if they're facing discrimination at the workplace, if they're not getting paid, these are their protections, right? And that is something that I think Stephen also mentioned, is like reaching the communities where they are, so that we don't expect them to be coming to us for the information. We take it directly to them. It's a lot of work, and the thing is, it's non-traditional for newsrooms to be doing that, but I think we need to move more towards that and just really emphasize the collaborations that we can do with all the organizations. Another thing that we're doing, documented, is we write in 3 languages, Spanish, Chinese, and Haitian Creole. And we also deliver the news information in 3 platforms: on WhatsApp for Latino and Spanish-speaking communities, Nextdoor we use for Caribbean communities, and WeChat for Chinese communities. And the idea is to take all the work that's being done right here and really summarize it to the way that is accessible for people, so that they can consume it in a language that they feel comfortable and in platforms that they already have. So if they have WhatsApp on their phone, it's very easy to go and just check everything, as opposed to them going to our website and having to look for a lot of the articles there. Let me see what's this one. Another thing also in terms of changing the narrative is really finding a way to provide something in exchange of the information that they're giving us. Because we are journalists, I speak for journalists, we're really good at reporting problems, but not good at reporting the solutions. And I think it's really important to be able to write the news article, but also be able to inform people what they can do to solve those problems. And what we do a lot of the times is through WhatsApp, we get comments of people asking, how to file my asylum case, or what happened if I don't file my asylum case in 1 year. We report on the issue, on how they're struggling to find lawyers, but at the same time, we let them know that if you don't file asylum, these are the things that you can do, and why you should basically continue to be working on finding a lawyer, or if you can file with some other organization. And lastly, I would like to say that someone mentioned earlier in a different panel that we need to adapt in sending the message to people. And I agree, because when I was talking to people in Jackson Heights last week, this naturalized person told me that they had voted for Trump, even though they had a sister who was undocumented. And to me, it was a little bit bizarre, because I asked her, like, hey, they plan to deport every undocumented person. Does that still make you feel okay with your vote? And what they told me is like, yeah, but there is, good immigrants versus bad immigrants. And I think for us, at least, in my case, my job is to understand why the immigrant community feel that there is this, separation between a good immigrant and a bad immigrant, and what it is actually, because we can come up with so many interpretations, but at the end of the day, they're voting for Trump thinking that they're not going to be impacted. And so that is something that I would like to leave all of you with, is just really trying to understand the communities and avoid putting ourselves in the, in their perceptions, and ask them, what do you mean by this? Thank you.
I'm going to pose one question, and then I think we'll go to the audience. Oops. Just do a quick time check. Yeah. And then I think we also want to try to take any online question, or 1 or 2 online questions as well, if we can. All right. Let's get this back in here. So, Edafe, I'm just going to use you as an example initially. When I was doing a little bit of homework in preparation for this panel, I read an article in which you said, activism is not what people think it is. I consider myself a business person more than an activist. I have an opportunity to solve a market problem, which is the rights, dignity, and decency for people to build a future in America. I would like to hear from you as well as the rest of the panel on how within the context of your organizations you define activism or advocacy and the types of things you do on those fronts as well as in organizing, something Steve mentioned, and what role those things play relative to other ways of getting your messages out. And give some concrete examples if you can.
Yeah, Steve made an example earlier when he said, these are not the things they want to fund. So if I came into this work through a personal life experience that happened to me, but my life experience is not representative of the entire community I want to serve. For me to be able to serve that community, I have to be able to write a business plan, which is like, you have to employ people in the nonprofit you create, pay them salary, and do payroll. So as an activist, I don't think through my activism as just like protesting on the streets. There are activists who do that. I do feel the vacuum I want to fill is to give people a tangible support that can help them move from one place to another. I used to run a shelter for asylum seekers, and in the space of 4 years, I know about 8 people that came into America that were in the New York City rescue shelter system. It's like you go to a shelter in the night, the amount of people that come in first sleeps, the rest people have to look for another place to stay. So we go through the rescue shelter system and say, are you a migrant? They're like, yes. We're like, okay, you can come to our shelter to stay. And when they come to our shelter, we connect them with social services. Sometimes they come in through resettlement agency, but we want to move them to a place whereby they can have a first paycheck, then rent an apartment and start their life. So having an investment in that individual require you to be able to have a business plan. So I, as an individual, I've already made the sacrifice that I don't want to make money economically or to live a large life. So I am investing all my resources and all my wisdom or all my resources to be able to help people. So my business is helping people move from one place to another. So I'm willing to make that sacrifice as an activist. So my activism is a sacrifice I have made for economic return in society, quote unquote, to be able to help others live a better life.
Either of you want to add anything?
Yeah, so because we're in the news industry, we're not really activists. What we do is mostly provide information as a service. And by that, we also report on facts, right? Like we report on things as they happen, and we just give context on that. But at the end of the day, we're not trying to change anyone's mind. I think people eventually will change their mind whether they choose to or not. So.
Yeah, I would just say I've been working on immigration issues for I'm dating myself here now, nearly 30 years, right? I remember I first got my start working on the Fix 96 campaign, and we're still working on the Fix 96 campaign. It's. I would just say that I think the current state of public support around immigration is at a very, very low place, right? I think a lot of people in the room can remember where we were 11 years ago in 2013 when the Senate passed an immigration bill by, a 68 to 32 margin or something like that, and we all thought that it was like a done deal, right? And when you look at the course of where we actually stand with immigration reform, we are far from that. Why is that the case? There's all sorts of different reasons that I would say, but I do think part of it is that we've gotten stale as a movement, and we need to think about how we're going to, what are the messages, what's the narrative, but also what's the organizing that we need to do to really get back to that place, because it's a severe fall where we stand now from where we were 11 years ago. And so, I just think that we need to really be cold-eyed and sober about thinking about where we stand right now. We are not anywhere near the kind of political heft that we had 11 years ago. And so I really think that means looking at, what we need to do to organize other folks, donors, funders, but also other policy researchers, advocates, and figure out, and really take a longer-term view about how we're going to get back to that space, because it's a little depressing.
I just want to add to this conversation. This morning before I came, I watched Justin Trudeau making an argument that Canada is going to pause migration for 2 years so that they can reach a linear growth curve in their population. I was on the board of Rainbow Railroad, a nonprofit that helps migrants move to Canada. Canada have been perceived to have progressive migration for a very long period of time. I do think, as proponents of a welcoming migration system, we also have to note that sometimes countries go through restrictive policy making in order to achieve economic policies that are beneficial for residents of the country. That does not mean a total grind or halt in the immigration system. And that is something I try to think about, is that the mass deportation, the rhetoric against migrant, the vilification, is going beyond the economic messaging of what is appropriate amount of migrants that should come to the country in terms of economic balancing to just a total surrender and vilification of migrants. So we can have that conversation in the sense that right now, the amount of migrants that are coming in and what type of migration we want without vilifying migrants. That was what our mayor did, in a sense that says migrants are going to destroy New York City. In that conversation, people who are day-to-day New Yorkers who do not understand how migration work see their cost of living going up, and they blame the migrants for it, rather than having an understanding that every budgeting in the city, the mayor cuts things and add it back as a part of the budgeting process. So in the panel that was discussing before us, this was some of the conversation that was happening, is that there is a disconnect between migration policy and how individuals in society are viewing their own individual life experiences.
We have questions from the audience?
Hi, can you hear me? Rachel Schwartz from the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Thanks for this panel. I think we have a lot of looking in the mirror to do, all of us. And, we at the health department, particularly the team that's here today, work hard to, reach immigrant communities to provide services and inform them about the services that we provide. And I think we do an okay job of actually including those folks in the narrative building and the communications we're trying to build. But I do think that there is a lot to this argument of folks who are not immigrants seeing this economic climate as immigrants as a good scapegoat for what is going on in this economic climate. So I would be curious to hear all of your thoughts on how, and one thing that everybody has in common is that they don't fully trust government at the moment, so I don't take it personally. But I think we have to think about how we're reaching immigrant communities without alienating other folks and making the argument that the services that we're providing to immigrant communities benefit everyone. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of how government can do a better job of reaching all of those communities and making effective arguments about, service delivery, et cetera.
So one of the things that I have seen is very successful is I think in Queens when Gotham Health and hospitals have worked with NICE, the new immigrant community empowered organization, and what they have done is sort of created this fair where they invite a lot of migrants in, but at the same time they welcome it to the public. I think that's like a strong message to send because just because of how like much polarized the term for an immigrant has taken in the country, I think some people tend to believe that anything that has the word migrant is not for them, right? So I think if more work can be done with organizations that have the trust of the community in a neighborhood, the outreach can be better, for the communities that have arrived, but also the local people that are there all the time, right? Because when I went to that specific fair, I saw people that had been here for 30 years, people that were born in Queens, and also people that have been here for 2 years. And I think that's something that can be replicated. I know the Department of Health does a lot of outreach with the organization, so I think doing more of that and just continue the work, I think, has been fantastic.
I think it's a really tough question. I think the one thought that I would have is to make how can we make the benefit for non-immigrant communities really concrete? I mean, we can talk until we're blue in the face about how immigrants can create jobs and help employers. I think we need to get those employers and have them together, demonstrate and show them, tell the stories of people who are beneficially impacted by that, right? And this example is not always going to be able to happen everywhere, but I do think like making that concrete, finding people who are going to talk about how their lives were beneficially impacted by immigrants or by whatever kind of outreach that you're doing. I think that's actually that's something that I do think can be helpful.
Also, the figurehead in your agency also matters. If the mayor of New York City, when we had the highest amount of migrants coming to New York City, was not demonizing migrants versus New Yorkers, many New Yorkers wouldn't have felt like the migrants were taken out of their day-to-day life. We are pitting who is the poorest in society. How can we make the poorest in society the issue? We do have a severe budget deficit in the city, but when the highest amount of migrants were coming and the mayor enacts a 30-day and 60-day shelter limit, what that created was like most people did not even know that the rate of enrollment in New York City schools was very poor. Schools were closing. If not for 40,000 migrant children, most of our kids would not be in school today. So they helped us keep our enrollment rate higher. Although it added cost to like English as a second language and some other costs to our schools, but it also helped New York schools stayed afloat. So when the mayor said these migrants are all going to destroy our city, everybody turned their gaze to be like, the shelters are full as the migrants. I cannot get an hospital appointment as the migrant. So narrative building and narrative controlling matters. Chicago had a similar situation. Migrants were overflowing in the city, but the figurehead was like, we're going to build a city that will be able to integrate these migrants with our community. So I do think that there are real issues that the migrant pose to our city, but how we talk about it, in part, our individuals in that community tend to talk about it with others in the community as well.
Thank you. I'm Carmen Mackillon from Catholic Charities of Long Island. And just wanted to echo what Department of Health was saying. And you have to really know your local communities. Being from Long Island, the message from the politicians was all the migrants that are arriving in New York City are going to come to Long Island, are going to come to Nassau County, are going to come to Suffolk County. And the message was, and we're not going to let them take your benefits. But when I would walk with a refugee to the Department of Social Services, we were very well taken care of. So it's the message that one sends in order to affect those voters, and the reality might be another, but it affects us all. We have a program called Refugee Health Promotion. With this, we try to educate refugees about the essence of staying healthy, having health insurance. So what we do with this is we do a local fair, a health fair. It was going to be covered by the local media, and I knew that the minute they were going to hear, or the local community was going to hear, that refugees were getting free health insurance, that a lot of people were going to come back and say, what about me? I have to pay $1,000 for my health insurance. So it's how you then send a message. Yes, we are educating refugees because they're going to be part of your community, and you need them to be healthy. And you need them to educate that later on they're going to have to pay for that insurance just the same way as everybody else who has made it out of that poverty level now has to pay. So it's reversing that message and making it seem as if all of these benefits that you're giving these refugees are for the benefit of the receiving communities, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. We want them to integrate, and we want the local receiving communities to feel that, hey, they are part of us, and this is the way that we have to do it. Thank you.
I don't know if I'm chosen. May I?
My question is mainly to Rommel, but to everyone. How do we hold journalists accountable? And what I mean by that is, I'm not talking about Fox News or Breitbart. I'm talking to who's listening in today, by the way. I'm talking about mainstream media. It's like mainstreaming misinformation. So there's an internet rumor, J.D. Vance repeats it, Trump repeats it, and the headline is, Trump says Haitians are eating pets. And if I'm reading that article, the third or fourth paragraph says, this is debunked. There's no evidence for this. So the person who's reading it believes that the Haitians are eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. And even with Trump's candidacy, they give him a platform, and they'll clarify that this is misinformation, but the damage is done when they report what he says. And I just don't how you would say to a journalist, well, what you're doing is you're promoting misinformation by the way you write this article. It's a little frustrating. It might just be me that reads it that way, but it just seems like misinformation is more mainstream now. And how do you get newspapers, even the Washington Post, to adjust to that, I guess?
Yeah, I think so. It's a discussion that I always have with my newsroom as well. And the thing is, we're seeing national newspapers across the board from both sides of the aisle just really go for clicks. They want to attract people, as many viewers as possible. And I think now in the journalism industry, there is a movement to create and embrace local newsrooms, because they are the ones that really, take that information, go in depth, and really explain what's happening. For example, when they said that they were eating pets, right? I think the Haitian Times really did amazing work to debunk that, at the in a local level, so that people that live in that community, they say okay, this is a lie. But I think a lot of organizations still, they would rather go and speak with the New York Times or the Washington Post rather than speaking with the local newsrooms that don't have a lot of readership, right? So I think it's also like an opportunity for us now to really see who's doing the legwork on the ground and really give them a chance, like really share the research, share, someone, a spokesperson to give that information to them so that we can not only, fight the misinformation that's on a local level from the mainstream media, but also, help the local newsroom sort of develop relationships with people who are the voters that are making the decisions at the end of the day. And then we also have, uh, you know, civil journalists on TikTok and other like social platforms, which is a completely different, sort of game now, and they have a larger readership than most of the newspapers. We have YouTubers that have millions of views per episode, and they really make a lot of impact in the communities, right? So I think it's really like you said, like an uphill battle in all fronts. But I think like this election and the time that we're living in is an opportunity to see, how we can actually start reaching people in ways that they want to be reached, and also avoid the assumptions that we have made all the time. Because even with the New York Times, headline, for example, I would assume that the people reading it are like people like me, people that like to be reading and does it for a job. I doubt that someone that's working 60 hours a week is reading that. They're gonna be on their phone 15 seconds on TikTok, and that's where they get their information. So to answer your question is, I don't know. And I think the industry is trying to shift towards local newsrooms being important again. And we'll just have to see how that goes in the next, 4 years or a decade.
I would just add real briefly, I think that's exactly right. The reason why that rumor got such legs was not because it was in the Washington Post. It's because it got packaged by Hygo News and repeated on all sorts of YouTube and TikTok accounts, which honestly, the right wing is much more potent around, and that's why it got so much traction, right? It's not because it was on ABC News or New York Times or Washington Post. And so if we are going to do something, we're going to have to play in that space in the same way that the right wing does. And apologies, I don't know if there are any right wing folks out here, but like that, I mean, that's the reality. That's where that battle is getting fought, because when you are someone who's not engaged and you're not reading the Washington Post, you are spending 15 seconds on TikTok. And you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. And then you see it reposted, and there's a surround sound effect, and that becomes their reality.
I just want to add that the Washington Post, the New York Times, all the liberal newspapers do not interview migrants that are affected by the issue. They always interview. I watch Money Joe because I have cable. I could pay for it. Not all immigrants can pay for it. But every time I watch Money Joe and they are talking about migrants, they never, for once, bring a migrant to talk about it. It's always presidential historian and people who have years of experience about how immigration has worked. Number two is that we cannot only talk about the importance or the good things about immigration and forget the pain that people are feeling. When Trump talked about the migrants eating the dog and cat, even though he's saying it wrongly, the people who live in that community felt like somebody saw their pain. The white people, for example. I'm not saying they're right. When Kamala Harris went throughout her campaign, and communities in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, that are seeing the negative impact of immigration in their community, and she never spoke for once about it, they felt abandoned. So even though you have policy to integrate the migrants, you have to speak about it in the same way people are speaking against migrants. And I don't think the Democratic Party did that, if we're all honest to ourselves. They never laid out a platform for how do we integrate new migrants that are coming to America. And people want to feel like, if my money is going towards helping people, let me know what is helping them to do. So they can debunk it and say, this is how much we are spending on migrants, and this is what we plan more to spend. Your money is not going all the way towards X, Y, or Z. I think that is a fault of the Democratic Party, is that they all speak in white papers. People don't understand what they are saying most of the times.
Thank you, Edafe. What a great panel. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. So we're at lunchtime now. We have about 25, 30 minutes. I know that sounds short, but we're not going out. We're just going down the hall. To the right is where the lunch is set up, so you can just queue and come out and eat out here, and we'll start in about 25, 30 minutes again.